Tales from the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens.
The story of the strange client.
In the Borough High Street, near St George's Church, used to stand the smallest of our debtors' prisons, the Marshalsea. In later times, it became a very different place to the sink of filth and dirt that it once was. However, even in its improved condition, it held out little temptation to the extravagant or consolation to the improvident. In this part of London, the street was broad and the shops spacious. All the busy sounds of traffic resounded in it from morn to midnight, the noise of passing vehicles and the footsteps of a perpetual stream of people. But the surrounding streets were mean and close. Poverty and debauchery lay festering in the crowded alleys. Neglect and misfortune were pent up in the narrow prison. An air of gloominess seemed to hang about the scene.
Many years ago, these pavements were worn with the footsteps of a mother and child. Day by day, as surely as the morning came, they presented themselves at the prison gate, a whole hour too early. This was often after a night of restless misery and anxious thoughts. Turning meekly away from the prison, the young mother would lead the child to the old bridge, raising him up in her arms to show him the glistening water that was tinted with the light of the morning sun, attempting to interest his thoughts in the objects before him. But she would quickly set him down, and hiding her face in the shawl, gave vent to the tears that blinded her. For no expression of interest or amusement lit up his thin and sickly face. His recollections were few enough, but they were all of one kind, all connected with the poverty and misery of his parents. The father and mother looked on this, and upon each other with thoughts of agony that they dared not breathe in words. The healthy, strong-made man, who could have borne almost any physical exertion, was wasting beneath the close confinement and unhealthy atmosphere of a crowded prison.
Winter came, and with it weeks of cold and heavy rain. The poor girl had moved to a wretched apartment close to the spot of her husband's imprisonment. And though the change had been necessary by their increasing poverty, she was happier now for being nearer him. For 2 months, she and her little companion watched the opening of the gate as usual. But one day, for the first time, she failed to come. Another morning arrived, and she came. Alone. The child was dead. It was plain to those who looked upon the mother's altered face that death must soon close the scene of her adversity and trial. Her husband's fellow prisoners shrank from intruding on his grief and misery, leaving him alone in the small room he had previously shared. She now shared it with him, lingering on, without pain, but without hope. Her life ebbed slowly away. She had fainted one evening in her husband's arms, and he bore her to an open window to revive her with the air.
Set me down, George. Oh, it's very hard to leave you. But it's God's will, and you must bear it for my sake. Oh, how I thank him for having taken our boy. He is happy and in heaven now. What would he have done here without his mother?
You shall not die, Mary. You shall not die. Rouse yourself, my dear. Pray, pray do. You will revive yet.
Never again, George. Let them lay me by my poor boy now. Oh, you must promise me. Promise that if you ever leave this dreadful place and should grow rich, you will have us removed. Take us to some quiet churchyard a long way off, where we can rest in peace. Oh,
I do. Speak to me, Mary. Another word, one look.
He ceased to speak, for the arm that clasped his neck grew stiff and heavy. Her lips moved and a smile played upon her face. But the lips were pale, and the smile faded into a rigid and ghastly stare. He was alone in the world. That night, in the silence and desolation of his miserable room, the wretched man knelt down by the dead body of his wife. He called on God to witness a terrible oath.
From this hour, I devote myself to the revenge of your and my child's death. To the last moment of my life, my energies will be directed to this one cause. My revenge will be protracted and terrible. My hatred will be undying as I hunt through the world for those who caused it.
In that one night, the deepest despair and scarcely human passion made fierce ravages on his face and form. His companions in misfortune shrank from him, afraid as he passed by. His eyes were bloodshot and heavy, his face a deadly white, and his body was bent as if with age. He had nearly bitten through his underlip in the violence of mental suffering. The blood which flowed from the wound trickled down his chin, staining his shirt and neckerchief. No tear or sound of complaint escaped him, but the unsettled look and disordered haste with which he paced up and down the yard told of the fever which was burning within him.
His wife's body had to be removed from the prison without delay. He received the communication with perfect calmness. Nearly all the inmates had assembled to witness its removal. The rude coffin was borne slowly forward on men's shoulders. They reached the spot where the bereaved husband stood and stopped. He laid his hand upon the coffin, mechanically adjusted the pall which covered it, and motioned them onwards. The turnkeys in the prison lobby took off their hats as it passed through, and in another moment, the heavy gate closed behind it. George Heyling looked vacantly at the crowd and fell heavily to the ground.
Help! 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 Help!
For many weeks after, in the wildest ravings of fever, neither the consciousness of his loss nor the terrible vow he had made ever left him for a moment. When the fever eventually subsided, he awoke to find himself rich and free, and to hear the tale of two fathers. First, his own father had been found dead in his feather bed of down. This was the man who would have let him die in jail, who had let his wife and child die of want, those who were far dearer to him than his own existence. This father had decided to disinherit him and leave him a beggar, but proud of his own health and strength, he had put off the act of disinheritance until it was too late, and now might be gnashing his teeth in the other world at the thought of the wealth his remissness had left him.
George Heyling awoke to this and to recollect the new purpose for which he lived, remembering that his main enemy now was a second father, his wife's. He was the man who had first cast him in prison, who had spurned his own daughter and her child from the door when they sued at his feet for mercy.
Heyling caused himself to be carried from the scene of his loss and misery to a quiet residence on the sea coast to restore his energies and meditate on his task. And here was cast in his way the opportunity for his first and most horrible revenge. It was summertime, and wrapped in his gloomy thoughts, he was seated one calm evening at a wild and lonely spot that had struck his fancy during his daily ramblings. Now and then, he raised his head to watch the flight of a seagull, or gazed along the glorious crimson path that began in the middle of the ocean. This path seemed to lead right up to the verge where the sun was setting. Suddenly, this profound stillness was broken. Doubtful of having heard right, he listened and started to his feet, hastening in its direction. The tale told itself at once. Some scattered garments lay on the beach, a human head just visible above the waves a little distance from the shore. And there was an old man, wringing his hands in agony, running to and fro, shrieking for assistance. Heyling's strength was now sufficiently restored. He threw off his coat and rushed towards the sea, with the intention of plunging in and dragging the drowning man ashore.
Hasten here, sir! In God's name, sir, help! He is my only son, sir, and dying before his father's eyes!
At the first words of the old man, the stranger checked himself. Folding his arms, he stood perfectly motionless.
Great God! George Heyling!
The stranger smiled and was silent.
Heyling! My boy, Heyling, my dear boy, look! He is alive yet! Save him!
The stranger smiled again and remained immovable as a statue.
I have wronged you. Be revenged. Take my all, my life. Cast me into the water at your feet, and I will die without stirring hand or foot. Do it, Heyling, but save my boy. He is so young to die.
Listen. I will have life for life. And here is one. My child died a far more agonizing and painful death than the one he is meeting. That young slanderer of his sister. You laughed at our sufferings then. What do you think of them now? See there. See.
As the stranger spoke, he pointed to the sea. The last powerful struggle of the dying man agitated the rippling waves for a few seconds. And then, the place where he had descended into his early grave was indistinguishable from the surrounding water.
3 years had elapsed from these events when a gentleman alighted from a private carriage at the door of a certain London attorney. This attorney was well known as a man of no great nicety in his professional dealings. The gentleman requested a private interview with him on important business.
Although not evidently past the prime of his life, the gentleman's face was pale, haggard, and dejected. Disease or suffering had done more to change his appearance than the mere hand of time could have achieved in twice the period of his entire life.
I wish you to undertake some legal business for me.
The attorney bowed obsequiously and glanced at a large packet that the gentleman carried in his hand.
This is no common business. Nor have these papers reached my hands without long trouble and great expense. As you will see, the man whose name they bear has borrowed large sums of money for many years. There was a tacit understanding between him and his creditors that the loan should be renewed from time to time. Nowhere is this understanding expressed in writing. I have purchased all the debts for many times their nominal value. The man has sustained significant losses of late. Were they to accumulate upon him, they would crush him to the earth.
The whole amount is many thousands of pounds.
It is.
What are we to do?
Do? put every engine of the law in force, every trick that ingenuity can devise, fair means and foul. The open oppression of the law, aided by all the craft of its most ingenious practitioners. I would have him die a harassing and lingering death. Ruin him, seize and sell his lands and goods, drive him from house and home, and drag him forth a beggar in his old age, to die in a common jail.
But the costs, my dear sir, the costs of all this. If the defendant be a man of straw, who is to pay the costs, sir?
Name any sum, and it's yours. Don't be afraid to name it, man. I shall not think it dear if you gain me my objective.
The attorney named a large sum as the advance he required to secure himself against the possibility of loss. But this was more with a view to ascertaining how far the client was really disposed to go. The stranger wrote a cheque for the whole amount immediately and left. The draft was duly honoured, and the attorney began work in earnest for his strange client. For more than 2 years afterwards, George Heyling would sit whole days together in his office, poring over the papers as they accumulated, reading again the letters which flooded in as legal suit after legal suit was begun. Expressions of protest, prayers for a little delay, representations of certain ruin for the opposite party. To all such applications for a brief indulgence, there was but one reply.
The money must be paid.
Land, house, furniture, all were taken. The old man himself would have been imprisoned had he not escaped the vigilance of the officers and fled. On being informed of this flight, Heyling's fury was unbounded. He was only restored to comparative calmness by repeated assurances of the certainty of discovering the fugitive. Agents were sent in search of him in all directions. Every strategy was resorted to for the discovery of his place of retreat. But it was all in vain. Half a year passed and he was still undiscovered. One night, Heyling appeared unannounced at the attorney's private residence. Before the attorney could order the servant to admit him, he rushed up the staircase and entered the drawing room, pale and breathless. Having closed the door to prevent being overheard, he sank into a chair.
Sir!
Hush! I have found him at last.
No. Well done, my dear sir. Well done.
He lies concealed in a wretched lodging in Camden Town. Perhaps it is as well we did lose sight of him, for he has been living alone there in the most abject misery. And he is poor, very poor.
Very good. You will have the warrant made tomorrow, of course.
Yes. Stay. No. Make it for the following day. You are surprised at my wishing to postpone it? I had forgotten. The next day is an important anniversary in his life. Let it be done then.
Heyling and the officers met on the appointed night. He directed the driver of the hackney coach to stop at the corner of the old Pancras Road, the location of the parish workhouse. They entered a small by-street. This was a desolate enough place, surrounded by little other than fields and ditches. Muffled in his cloak, Heyling stopped before the meanest-looking house and knocked gently on the door. It was opened by a woman who dropped a curtsy of recognition. Heyling whispered the officers to remain below. Creeping gently upstairs, he opened and entered the door of the front room. Now, a decrepit old man, the object of his search and unrelenting hatred, was sat at a bare wooden table, on which stood a miserable candle.
What now? What now? What fresh misery is this? What do you want here?
A word with you.
As Heyling spoke, he seated himself at the other end of the table, and throwing off his cloak and cap, disclosed his features.
Heyling!
This day, 6 years ago, I claimed the life you owed me for my child's. beside the lifeless form of your daughter, old man. I swore to live a life of revenge. I have never swerved from my purpose for one moment. And if I had, one thought of her uncomplaining, suffering look as she drooped away, or of the starving face of our innocent child, would have nerved me to my task. My first act of requital you well remember. This is my last. Tomorrow I leave England. Tonight I consign you to the living death to which you devoted her. A hopeless prison.
Heyling raised his eyes and lifted the light to the old man's face that was now slumped over the table. Then he set it gently down and left the apartment.
You'd better see to the old man,
He said to the woman as he opened the door and motioned the officers to follow him into the street.
I think he's ill.
Beneath a plain gravestone, in one of the most beautiful and secluded churchyards in Kent, wild flowers mingle with the grass. A soft landscape forms the fairest spot in the garden of England. Here lie the bones of a young mother and her gentle child.
But the ashes of the father do not mingle with theirs. Nor did the attorney ever gain the remotest clue as to the subsequent history of his strange client. The Tale of the Strange Client featured the voices of Lisa Nightingale, Jim Newberry, and Mike Ayres. It was adapted and directed by Jim Newberry, with a soundscape realised by Robbie Burgess. It is a joint Old Dolly and Peoplescope production.